Welcome everybody, this is Heresy Financial. This is the channel where we talk about educational financial topics in a way that's considered a heresy to the financial establishment. Today we're talking about real estate. I've received a lot of questions lately from friends and family about how real estate might be affected in the coming economic crash. So today we're going to dive into that a little bit. There's a couple different areas of real estate that we're going to talk about, and how the potential outcomes of the coming economic recession and crash might impact you, and what that might mean for your personal residence or your investment portfolio. So before we dive in, I would like to give a little bit of a background on where I'm coming from as far as real estate. So I have one investment property. It's a single family home. It's in a C-class neighborhood, and it rents for about $11.50 a month, 3 bedrooms. So that's my one property, and I also invest in a private real estate fund that invests in a couple hundred unit properties. And so from an investment perspective, I'll be talking about that, and then I'll also talk about why I've chosen at this point to not yet buy a personal residence, because of some of the things that we're going to be talking about here today. When people approach this topic, obviously the freshest thing in their memory is going to be 10 years ago. It's going to be what happened in 2009, people losing their homes, people were overexposed, had multiple mortgages on their personal residence, had multiple rental properties, had been purchasing up these brand new homes that were appreciating in appraised value extremely quickly. The quote-unquote wealth effect was driving this bubble, and people were using the equity to basically expand, and the appraised equity to purchase more homes. They pull it out, down payments, and they get overexposed, over leveraged, and that's kind of what wiped out the system. You can blame the government for the lack of regulation. You can blame the big banks for providing these loans, packaging them up and selling them to pension funds, whatever. You can also blame individuals for getting into too much debt, exposing themselves to too much risk. So everybody was to blame, and so that's not what this is about. We're just gonna kind of try and look at what the next one will look like, what the next crash will look like, and how most likely it's going to be different than the last time. The last time we had a recession, basically what happened is it was going to be pretty bad, and it could have been a lot worse than what actually ended up happening. And the reason why it was kind of cut off was because the government stepped in and they bought up all of the bad loans. They bought up all the bad assets. They bought all of the broken financial instruments out there, and then put them on the balance sheet of the Fed. So what that means is the Federal Reserve just bought it all up, and they soaked up, they swallowed the bomb basically. And so this allowed the financial institutions that make up the network and the plumbing, if you will, of the financial system that we have to keep on operating. They allowed some rules to be rewritten with the generally accepted accounting principles. That's GAAP, that's the GAAP principles on how you list things on your books, your assets, your liabilities. So they allowed some changes to be made to that, so that companies, big banks, wouldn't have to declare bankruptcy, because they were kind of viewed as the plumbing, the system that held the financial foundation together. So the government swallowed this bomb, and what ended up happening was, in order to do that, they had to print a lot of money to buy up all of these bad assets at prices that weren't fire sale prices, so that the market wouldn't utterly collapse in on itself. And it was viewed as an emergency measure, and some of these things had spilled over to the rest of the world, and so the rest of the world was in trouble too. And so the buying up of these bad bonds was viewed as a rescue emergency measure by the government, and the rest of the world was on board with that. And so when the government had to create all this debt, they printed a lot of money to be able to create this debt, to be able to absorb it from the federal government, but most of the world absorbed a lot of it too. Treasuries were purchased by and large all around the world, and dollars were consumed all around the world. So all the inflation that we created was exported overseas basically, and it was absorbed by central banks around the world. again, largely because it was viewed as an emergency measure. And the long-term plan was eventually the Federal Reserve, you've probably heard this phrase before, they would bleed off their balance sheet. They would start to get rid of some of these bad assets that they accumulated 10 years ago, and they'd start to shrink that down. So they'd start to they'd slowly let the malinvestments that were created, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, slowly start to go away and bleed off the balance sheet. Well, the Federal Reserve kind of kept up the guise that this is what they were going to be doing until December. You've heard of the Powell pause. That's when they stopped increasing rates. They stopped bleeding off their balance sheet. They still have 99% of the bad assets that they had, started accumulating back in 2009. And now they're lowering rates again. So what they're doing is saying we can't actually afford to let our economy take the shrinking that would take place if we start to unload these into the market. If we keep on doing that, that's going to cause everything to kind of spiral out of control again, like it was back in 2009. And so they're saying all we can do now is create more easy money, print more money, cheap debt, flood the system with the financial heroin that it's already addicted to. And now they have no plans to continue to shrink and get rid of and get the economy back on solid footing, because they can't. They backed themselves into a corner. They've blown up a bubble that just can't be released slowly. And so the only opportunity, the only outcome for them is to keep on blowing more air into the bubble to kind of hopefully delay the pop or delay the rapid losing of air out of the bubble, if you will, as long as possible. Kick that can down the road as far as possible. Trump knows this. That's why he wants them to lower rates. That's the only thing that would get him potentially reelected, is keeping the stock market up and keeping the bubble from collapsing and imploding. And so that's why he wants them to lower rates as well. So that's the situation that we're in right now. And so 10 years ago, the government swallowed the bomb. It absorbed the malinvestments from the system, and the rest of the world was okay with that because it was an emergency measure. Well, now that things are starting to turn over, we're faced with a very different situation. The financial system itself is actually pretty strong. We don't see a lot of leverage in the banks. We don't see a lot of these crazy instruments that the banks and the investment bankers were using, 10, 15 years ago. We don't see a lot of the same signs in the financial sector. In fact, a lot of financial firms learned their lesson, and they're acting pretty conservatively. There are a lot of financial firms out there that invest the majority of their assets in US Treasuries. So they learned their lesson, and so we don't see some of those same signs in the financial sector. But the problem is not in the financial sector. The problem is with the government, because as this thing starts to turn over, it's the government that's insolvent. Their obligations, their off-balance budget, even their on-budget expenditures are way more than they can afford. And so the debt is just going to keep on piling and piling and piling up. And the Federal Reserve has no choice but to keep that going, because if they stop, everything will kind of unravel. And the rest of the world is catching on. And so they know that the dollar is becoming worth less and less and less and less. And so all around the world, you see preparations for this. Central banks are buying up gold like crazy. Central banks are prepping to lower their own interest rates so that their own currencies don't become, in the short term, uncompetitive and provide their countries with a bad exchange rate. And so you see, like New Zealand just did this a couple of weeks ago without any warning. They dropped their interest rates by, I think, 0.5%, just to stay competitive, basically. So you see things like this happening all around the world, where basically the world is preparing for the collapse of the dollar. Central banks know what's happening. When you want to talk about the big fish and the big investors, the central banks are the biggest investors. So they're the ones that are prepping for this ahead of time. And a lot of the big hedge funds are preparing for this as well. You see people like Ray Dalio and Jim Rogers and a lot of these legendary investors saying, hey, stock up on gold. They're saying buy gold. And the reason is because the dollar is about to become worth less and less and less and less. And it's because the only tool that the Federal Reserve has is to print more and more and more and more of this money. So we're going to get to real estate. Don't worry. This is all going to kind of come full circle here. So because all of these central banks and big players around the world are prepping for this, the big money is flowing into gold. They're preparing for unloading treasuries. And this is going to cause a self-reinforcing negative feedback loop where inflation is going to take off. What happens when inflation takes off? Well, we've had inflation for the last 10 years, but it's all just been exported. All those new dollars, all that extra money that we've created has been exported overseas. So we haven't seen the majority of that inflation hit our prices of our goods and services. What we have seen though, is we have seen that hit asset prices. Real estate prices have gotten back up or exceeded in a lot of areas what they were prior to the Great Recession. The stock market has, I think, it doubled within 8 years or so of the bottom of the Great Recession. So the assets, the asset classes, the asset bubbles have just been reinflated since then, and that's where a lot of the easy money and the cheap money and the inflation went. Well, when all of this inflation that we've exported overseas for the past 10 years starts coming home, and the world starts unloading the dollar and dumping treasuries, and the Federal Reserve has to absorb all of that liquidity and print money in order to do that, what we're going to see is that inflation is going to come back to America and hit us hard in prices, costs, goods, and services. And we've already started to see this a little bit. The Federal Reserve, they put out the inflation numbers, which are obviously they're intentionally manipulated because they have an incentive to create inflation without it actually showing up as there being inflation. So things like food and medical expenses and tuition, and they do things with microchips, computer chips to make sure that the inflation numbers look a lot lower than they really are. But pretty soon it's not going to be able to be kept under wraps, and people are going to notice that they can't pay their bills anymore. You're making 50 grand, 60 grand, 70 grand. You've got two income earners in a household and potentially earning 100, 120 grand with two workers, and you're not going to be able to pay your bills anymore. Food costs are going to start to go up. Housing costs, rents are going to start to go up really, really quickly. You're going to see medical costs go up. Anything that's subsidized by the government is going to have, continue to have this exponential increase like healthcare and tuition has over the past 10, 15 years. And so in terms of the dollar, and this is really key, in terms of the dollar, we're likely to see asset prices continue to go up. People are waiting on the sidelines with a lot of cash and a lot of US treasuries and bonds and these safe assets because they're waiting for the collapse. They're waiting to be able to buy things for cheap. They're waiting for these fire sale prices. And the fact of the matter is, when you measure it in terms of dollars, the dollars are going to be losing value so quickly that that they're going to outpace the drop in value of assets. So imagine you drop two things off of a cliff. You drop, let's say you take off your t-shirt, you throw your t-shirt down a cliff, and at the same time you throw a rock. Well, the rock is going to fall a lot faster than the t-shirt. That doesn't mean both of them aren't falling. But if you're stuck to the rock and you're looking up, it's going to look like that shirt is rising. But it's only compared to you because you're falling so much faster that it looks like that is rising. But objectively, in reality, they're both falling. So what that means is when you measure asset prices, the prices of goods and services, in terms of something stable that's not moving, like gold or silver, what you're going to see is everything is going to be collapsing in value. And there might be some stable currencies. We have no idea which ones would be, but you can speculate out there, and there might be some more stable currencies. But ultimately, all currencies are going to be affected at least somewhat. So when you measure something in terms of the stable things like the gold and silver, what you're going to see is everything in value is collapsing. But if you're anchored to the dollar and you're viewing things in terms of the dollar and you're measuring things in terms of the dollar, it's going to look like things are going up in price, because they will, because the dollar is going to be crashing so fast that anything measured in dollars is going to go up. So a really good example of this happening is anywhere in the last 100 years that you've seen hyperinflation. Zimbabwe, Russia, Venezuela, Argentina, Weimar Germany. Anytime we've seen hyperinflation in terms of the currency, everything gets extremely expensive. You can walk in with a pallet of money and you might not even be able to buy a loaf of bread. And so that is what is going to happen to stocks and to real estate. The prices will probably skyrocket. Just like prices of food will skyrocket, prices of just regular cost of like rents, cars, like anything you can buy in terms of the US dollar is probably going to get extremely expensive. And so anybody who's waiting on the sidelines in cash or in bonds is going to get wrecked by this, because you're waiting in something you think is safe, but it's going to start losing value so quickly that all these other things you were waiting to buy, like real estate and stocks, and maybe even gold, you're waiting for the price to come down. All of these things are going to start skyrocketing in price when measured in dollars, because your dollars are going to be losing value so quickly. And so we're not going to have a repeat of 2009 where you could pick something up that right now that, maybe cost $300,000 or $400,000. You could buy it 10 years ago for $50,000, $60,000. You're not going to see that same thing happen, because the world is not going to absorb the inflation that we're going to have to start creating. We're going to have to start creating inflation because the world is going to be unloading the inflation that we've created for the last 10 years. And so the prices of real estate are going to skyrocket. Now, how does this affect the average person? If you own your home right now, if you bought it before, 3 years ago, there's probably a very good chance that you've got some good equity in your home right now. There's an opportunity for you to use that equity, because when this starts spiraling, there's going to be financial insolvency in banks. There's going to be people who loan money are going to be hurt the most. The creditors are hurt by inflation. The debtors, the people who borrow money, are benefited by inflation. And so nobody's going to be loaning dollars when this starts to happen. Credit's going to kind of dry up. So right now, at least, there's an opportunity for anyone with significant equity in their home to pull some of that equity out while you still can and do something smart with it. Maybe that's using that money to buy, a cheap little rental property. Maybe that's buying some gold. Maybe that's buying some international stock funds, or maybe that's buying just some index funds and protecting it with options, or whatever you want to do with it. Do your research and make sure that you're, making a wise move. But there's an opportunity to use some of this equity, because if you get a fixed rate on the loan, if you take out a second mortgage or do a cash out refinance, as long as you get a fixed rate, essentially the inflation we're about to enter into is going to pay for that loan so quickly that it won't even be funny. Debt is going to become pretty much worthless, because you're going to see the cost of everything go up so dramatically that anything that benefits from inflation, like if you're on the right side of the cost, like let's say you have a rental property that you're renting out, those rents are going to skyrocket. So if you use debt to buy a rental property, your rents are going to go up so quickly that eventually you'll be able to pay off that mortgage that you used to buy that rental property like that. Rents are going to go, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month. There's potentially no end to how high that could go if the dollar actually fully collapses. So anytime you have debt in an inflationary environment, you benefit. And so you have this opportunity to pull some of this equity out if you have equity in a home and use it to your advantage. Now, don't get too risky, right? You don't want to do something where you're getting into something right now that might not cash flow, or that you're too over leveraged. You want to be wise about this and make sure that you're doing your research and talking to experts in your local market and area. But ultimately, there is an opportunity that in inflationary environments, if you have a loan, if you have debt, you are going to benefit from inflation. So the other thing that happens in bad economic crises is the supply of homes goes up. So this could happen to you, right? If you own your home, or even if you rent, let's say you lose your job, you don't have enough money to pay for your living spaces, you and maybe a close family friend, or maybe you and actual family, you guys move in together, share bedrooms. In bad economic times, families move back in together. It just happens. And so the supply of housing overall will go up. It just depends on how bad things get. They could go up dramatically. You could see the supply of homes go up 50%, 60%. And so how bad things get will determine how much the supply increases. So if you are banking on a single home investment property staying rented, that's a little bit of a gamble. So my property, I purchased it in a really, really low class neighborhood, intentionally, low income neighborhood, I should say, intentionally. And the reason for that is because when hard times hit, people downgrade, right? You go to the cheaper house, you move in with each other, and you go to, maybe if you both have to sell, you guys, move in somewhere that's a lot cheaper. You move into apartments, you move into condos. Everybody downgrades. It's the very expensive places to live that are going to go vacant when this happens. It's the 1, 2, 3 millionaires that are 70 and 80 years old that think that they're set. Their pension becomes worthless. Their Social Security becomes worthless because the dollar amount's not going to change, but the actual value of those pension and that fixed income can actually purchase becomes worthless. If your rent goes up to $10,000 a month and your Social Security stays at $1,500 a month, that's not enough, right? So as costs increase by inflation, anything that's a fixed income becomes less and less and less valuable. So it's those more expensive places that you can live in that are going to become vacant when this happens. So if you purchase something in a very low class, low income neighborhood, then you're probably going to be a little bit better off than buying something in a higher income neighborhood, like an A or B neighborhood. So the investment properties, there's a little bit of a gamble if it's a single family home, because if the supply of homes goes up, everybody's moving in together, everybody's downgrading, there's a good chance that you might not be able to pay your mortgage and you might lose the home. So if you have an opportunity to buy a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex, or you can join in with a larger investor on, a larger property that's, an apartment complex, 30, 60, 100 units, whatever it might be, go to real estate meetups in your areas to find people who are doing this and kind of partner with them and join in with them. You have an opportunity to get into something. The more doors that you own, the less likely it is that you'll lose the whole portfolio, because if the total supply increases by 40% and you've got 10 doors, then you're still able to rent out 6 of them. And if you can rent out 6 of them and costs are going up, there's still a good chance that you'll be able to keep on paying that mortgage for the whole portfolio. So the more doors you have, the better. That's why I like the lower income properties as well, because they're cheaper. So your money goes farther when you're trying to buy them. So that is kind of the gist of what is probably going to happen with real estate in this next crisis. We're going to see prices skyrocket. We're going to see costs of goods and services skyrocket, and people are going to be moving in together. So the supply is going to go up a lot as well. And so if you are in the market right now and you think, hey, I'm just going to wait to buy my home, I'm going to hold off, buy gold, buy silver, don't hold your money in cash or bonds right now if you're waiting for things to go on sale, because they will go on sale in terms of gold and silver. Things will not go on sale in terms of the dollar. In terms of the dollar, everything is just going to become more and more and more expensive. So let me know your thoughts. That's kind of a sweeping overview of my prediction on what's going to happen with real estate. Like I said, this is coming from, I've read dozens of books on real estate. I invest in a single family home myself and a private fund that invests in large, 100 unit properties, 100 unit plus properties. And so I have my foot in the industry, have my foot in the investments a little bit, not like some of these, huge gurus out there, but I do have some experience, so I'm not speaking completely out of ignorance. And that is my view on what's going to happen with real estate. And that's why my play right now is being as conservative as possible by holding a lot of my money in things like gold and silver, so that when things go on sale in terms of something stable like gold and silver, then I have the purchasing power to capitalize on that. I'm keeping as little of my money as possible in cash, no money in bonds, no money in CDs, no money in savings accounts, because anything that's a fixed income type of investment is going to become worthless pretty quickly. So that's my take. That's my prediction for real estate. We'll see when it happens. We'll see if it happens. I feel pretty strongly about it. That's why I'm making my plays that way. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.